Thank you very much, Anna. Just reflecting on your presentation, one phrase caught my attention when you talked about the need to develop an African discourse on climate change. And what immediately went through my mind is, how might this happen? And what, if any, external support may be required? So perhaps we might return to that later on in the discussions. We now turn to two very well-informed discussants to take us the next step. And we'll begin by asking Jonathon Porritt to speak. Jonathon, for those who may not know him in this room, has served as the chairman of the UK Sustainable Development Commission, which is the government's principal source of independent advice across the whole sustainable development agenda, certainly including climate change. He was formerly director of Friends of the Earth in the mid-1980s. He was the co-chair of the Green Party, also at that time, of which he's still a member. So I'm sure he's very pleased that there is now a member of Parliament sitting just across the river from us, allowing that voice to be heard in our legislature. So with that, over to you, Jonathon.
Well, thank you very much, and delighted to be here for this event. I've been involved with this project for quite some time, and actually I think it's an inspiring and really seriously helpful contribution to some very difficult challenges that we face at the moment. Reading through the reports again, I just wanted to comment a little bit on some of the things that are in common, as it were, between perceptions in Africa and perceptions in UK and Europe, and things that are very different, because I think there's some rather intriguing lessons to be teased out from that. Some of the similarities are a little bit discouraging. That sense of individual disempowerment seems to be popping up as much in the research from the interviews with people in Africa as it pops up in research about people's responses here in the UK. This sense that it's all so big and the little steps that we can make are so tiny in comparison to that. And it's sort of quite worrying that that disempowerment is shared in that way. Difficulties with language. I was fascinated by this problem of dealing with climate change in many languages when the concept of climate doesn't really exist, and that's a stretch beyond even us here in the UK. We have difficulties with language. We're still up the spout when it comes to people sorting out the difference between the greenhouse effect, climate change, global warming. Now, they may not sound that different, but I can assure you they are massively different in terms of the way we talk about these issues. And half our problem is that we haven't really been very effective in our terminology and the precision with which we use language in countries such as the UK. I also picked up, of course, confusion around the science. Please don't think that's just something that's going on in Africa. As you know, confusion about the science is fairly widespread, indeed one might say ubiquitous. And I was particularly struck with the confusion between climate change and ozone depletion being a sort of issue that is picked up on in the research. Well, even Mrs. Thatcher, in her brief, short-lived green period, was known to confuse the depletion of the ozone layer with the phenomenon of climate change. And she was a chemist and a prime minister. So you can see some of these differences kind of carry on at the same time. Two things I want to touch on that seem to me to be completely different. One of them is deeply ironic, given that we're talking here in Africa about least responsible for historical legacy damage and most seriously affected, which is an awful combination anyway. This phrase that comes up here, strong tendency for people to hold themselves individually or collectively responsible. Well, we do not have that phenomenon widely spread here in the UK or in most OECD countries. Indeed, the tendency, if there is a tendency, is to find all sorts of ways to play complicated pass-the-parcel games where you pass on your personal or collective responsibility to somebody else. And eventually you just do these whole circles that go on and on and on. And there's something terribly sad about that notion of that being a widespread perception amongst the 10 African countries. And the second bit that I thought was very different, and I was particularly focused on this in the research, was what they refer to as the will of God issues. And you just heard some references to that in the two presentations. And the crucially important role of faith leaders as part of this opportunity now to reach out and use communications in different ways through different channels in Africa. And I was very struck by that because I've been following the sort of role of the world's religions around climate change and sustainability for a very long time, and it's a bit of a mixed blessing, if I can use that terminology. It hasn't always been particularly helpful to see the role that the world's faith leaders has played, particularly if one thinks about the role of some of the evangelical churches in the United States in the late 1990s and the first part of the first decade of this century. That faith-based leadership was astonishingly pernicious and in many respects contributed to a widespread phenomenon of denialism, which now, of course, in a lot of developed world countries is probably the single biggest barrier to enabling action on climate change to change people's lives. And there is a greater and greater concern, as you will know, in the science community about the phenomenon of denialism. We are really dependent on the world's faith leaders not becoming cheerleaders for denialistic tendencies around the science of climate change. So I was really trying to follow this story in Africa, the degree to which faith leaders will find their voice in the role that they have with their followers to ensure that that is not the case over there, whilst inevitably playing into a greater level of determinism and fatalism about responses to climate change, which I think we would probably find a little bit different and perhaps a little bit disconcerting. My conclusion from all of that, however, is that this research has really highlighted an extraordinarily humbling set of insights into the situation in Africa now. Humbling because it shows really how much we have collectively failed to do what we could and should have done for so many years. Humbling because the challenge ahead of us now in the rich world is still enormous. The value of this research, I think, is incredible, and the work that the British Council has been doing and will continue to do now in reaching out to communicators in Africa is obviously of critical importance. The role of the media itself is fundamental, and what I loved about this report is there was still some hope that the media have a positive role to play in communicating about climate change. It's almost like we're looking at the African media as a kind of tabula rasa, that this is still something that can become a force for good in helping people understand climate change. You read the Royal Society's latest report about communications around climate change here in the UK, and they would pin a lot of responsibility for miscommunication and confusion around climate change on our media. As you'll know, in this country we have a wide diversity of different media outlets, some of which are so utterly wretched as not to bear mentioning, and one just seriously hopes that we don't see a sort of Daily Mail type outbreak of idiocy all the way through the African media. So those are my sort of thoughts about that. I was very struck too, and about your comment about an African discourse on climate change, as you referred to that. And let's not underestimate the significance of that. African leadership on climate change is going to become more and more important. It was there in Copenhagen. There's no question about that. It was a very important voice in Copenhagen. It may not have got all the attention that perhaps it warranted, but the leadership from Africa is already significant, and I think most people involved in the UNFCCC process believe that that leadership voice is going to become more influential as these discussions follow their wearisome ways forward. African leadership will depend in large part on the degree to which people in Africa feel these issues as being absolutely germane to their own concerns and their own sense of what the international community should be doing with people in Africa to help bring change. So I was very struck by the connectedness between the quality of African leadership on climate change and the quality of communications around climate change, and not underestimating the significance of this challenge, because that leadership is crucial, which makes the whole communications agenda crucial too.